We started this about 5 years ago, Lou Halpin and I. And it's just part-time, working on it gradually. And we spent one whole year trying to find a printer who would accommodate us and we could do it for them. So we saw this 2 weeks ago, and now we have the copies. Amazingly, they are done in Hudson High School. We spent a whole year on the computer trying to find a publisher, a printer. And then Scott Wallingford of the history department, now he's in the administration building, the whole town of social studies. He said, go see Mr. McClellan at the high school. We did that last June, and he thought they could make our book. Brigham's Early Hudson History. You see, we did not write this. Lewis Halpin and I didn't write this book. Wilbur Brigham wrote these articles. We edited them. We compiled them into the book. These stories that he wrote from 1883 until 1900. And so it's not really a history book the way you had in school. It doesn't give events and dates. It doesn't give the war and the fire, whatever happened, and the date. It's about the people, the story of its people. People make a community. People make history. People put out those fires. People do the laws of the town. Not buildings, not dates, but people. So that's what he wrote about, was people. When people come to the museum, they want to know about their family, their genealogy, their people. They don't care about the buildings so much, the people. So that's what this book is about. So the book cover has a picture of Wilbur Brigham. You can tell he's only a teenager or maybe 20 years old in this particular picture. The next slide shows the first page of our book, a little outline of what you'll find in the book, as written by Wilbur F. Brigham. F is for Francis. His father was Francis. Everybody in town named Brigham was named a Francis Brigham because he was such an honorable, wealthy, considered a fine person and leader of the community. So all of his nieces and all his nephews and cousins had a name of Francis in them somehow. So at the beginning here we have a foreword. Who was Wilbur Brigham? We'll go on to that. So a little list of who was in it. This History of Hudson is a compilation of newspaper articles written by Wilbur F. Brigham to inform his fellow townspeople of the events and the people who had formed his new town of Hudson. He was born in Feltonville, in this northern section of Marlboro, on April 9th, 1839. As a young man, he learned shoemaking by hand in the early shops, attended the town affairs, promoted the formation of a new town of Hudson in 1866. He loved his town. He knew all of its people. He hired them in his shops, and he wanted all to know its heritage. The community formed along the Asset River was called, it was only a part of Marlboro, you had to sort of label it. So it was called Cow Commons because that's where you walked your cow every day to graze down on the common in the center of town. People didn't have room enough around their homes for a cow or their animals. It was called the mills because that's where the sawmill and the grist mill would be. The new city, the new part of Marlboro, and eventually it was called Feltonville. The post office was called Feltonville because you went downtown to Felton's store, down to the village to Felton's store. Its early history is found only in Charles Hudson's volume, The History of Marlboro, which was printed in 1863. There wasn't even any Hudson then. So if you want to go back to the older days of this area, it was in Marlboro that Charles Hudson wrote A History of Marlboro. This is Charles Hudson, very handsome man, a big guy. well over 6 feet. And he wrote this history of Marlboro. He wrote the history of Westminster and the history of Lexington in 2 volumes. He couldn't have written the history of Hudson because there was no Hudson. Just the early days of Marlboro were in it. The next one is Mr. Hudson said in his book, "It is our duty to transmit these records of the past to the generations which shall come after us. The deeds of our ancestors must not be permitted to sleep in darkness and in death." And that's what we tried to do, Louis Halpin and I. Bring those articles out to the light so that you could read them, so others can from the history of the town. So how did we find these stories? About 5 years ago, when the Hudson Historical Museum was upstairs in the town hall, a lady came in on a Tuesday afternoon when I was there and had a little box, like a candy box, like a chocolate box. And she said, "I'm getting rid of things." It was Mrs. D. Tomaso. I think it was Helen, her name. Her sister was Norma Urian, who you know wrote articles for the Hudson paper. So I guess it was in their heritage to save newspaper articles. So she was cleaning house, wanted to downsize, had this little box of newspaper clippings. The newspapers were very hard, very long, bigger than today's newspaper. And these columns were cut out so straightly and down, but they were like a yard long. So we took those columns. Jeanette Poplis worked in the museum that summer, and she took those columns that were all nicely trimmed and cut them into a size that would fit on a piece of paper, and then we were able to copy them so that we could use them. So this is how we received these articles. This is number 68, I think. This was published May 9th, 1896. It says up at the top there, The History of Hudson by Wilbur F. Brigham. So he was the one who this lady brought these articles. Well, oh yes, we'll accept almost anything that comes to town, come to the museum. We began to read them that summer. It was just amazing to read these articles written 125 years ago. So who was Francis Brigham? His father, they called him Captain. Everyone had a title, it seemed, Colonel, Captain, because of the GAR after the Civil War. They had units, like the American Legion would be, and they had rank. So Francis Brigham, his father, was the shoeman who had many shoe shops. His mother, well, this is not his mother, this is Mrs. Brigham. The first Mrs. Francis Brigham was Sophia Gleason, but she died at about 30 years old, leaving 5 children. And so one of them was Wilbur. So his mother had died, and Mr. Brigham found a new wife, Mrs. Brigham, and she was Emily Houghton, and they had a daughter named Ida. Mr. Francis Brigham, with Sophia, the first wife, there were 4 boys and 1 girl named Laura. So the second marriage was Mrs. Emily Houghton, was Ida, a daughter, Ida, and his third, after Mrs. Brigham died, his third one was Persis Gleason Watkins, a widow, a sister to Sophia. So he had known her for a long time. Of course, it was a fine match for Miss Houghton to find this husband. Even though he had 5 children, she had a house already full. But he was a well-to-do man with a great future, a lot of money, so it was a good catch for her. However, there were 5 children, and that was a lot of house. But you need a wife, a mother, a babysitter, a cook, when there are 5 children already in the house. So we think this is the second Mrs. Brigham, but there was no other name with her. Then we go on to the pictures of the boys. The 4 brothers, Wilbur and William, are twins. They're born April 9th, 39. So these are the twin brothers, and they had two other brothers, Rufus and Waldo. These four pictures, exactly alike, were found in a frame in the museum, all attached together. They were all taken at the same day at different ages, but they're all close together because when Mrs. Sophia died, the oldest, there were 5 children under 10 years old. So they're all pretty close to age. So these are the 4 boys. We don't have a picture of Laura. So we're going to the table of contents. When you open our book, what do you find inside? First, these are called landmarks. There are 9 of these stories with a Roman numeral 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and the date at each one. He just wrote these at random as he decided, I think the people in town would like to know these facts. So he wrote these columns that were interesting to the people. And then he went on to write 135 other columns, but these were his first 9 to try to practice and see if the community would accept them. Next we have a map of Feltonville. This is his town. He's now 11 years old. He's walking these, 14 years old maybe, and he's walking these streets. You notice it gives the names of every house or a farm or a business as they go along the street there. I forgot to bring my pointer. I'll have to go over here. What I want you to really notice is this line here. That is Worcester County. This is Middlesex County. This is Bolton, or part of Lancaster. Bolton was part of Lancaster. And this is Feltonville here on this side. But that line is important for you to realize. Wood Square was barely in Hudson. Here's Wood Square, right? Here's Lincoln Street, Central Street, River Street, and here that little triangle of grass where they have a flag or two is right here. The first house is right there. So that these people who lived and worked and went to school in Hudson, a lot of them came from Bolton. They lived right across, you're your neighbor, but they lived in Bolton. That's important for us to realize later as we plan the town boundary. Every name on there you'll find in 1853. These were his friends and neighbors, his employees that work in the shoe shop with him. So you might be able to find your genealogy through this, where they lived. And notice they all pretty much lived downtown. You had to walk everywhere. So let's live downtown where we don't have to walk so far to the store, don't have to walk to work so far. The out areas would be the farmers. Don't need that. So let's go on to